city of Atlanta was already buzzing with life as the early morning sun cast a golden glow across the skyline. The sound of car horns blended with the rhythmic clicking of dress shoes against the pavement. The streets were alive with the hustle and bustle of people trying to make their way toward their ambitions. For 32-year-old Jordan Adams, this Monday was more than just another workday. It was his chance to change his life. Jordan had spent the last 8 years at Ellington & Company, a respected finance firm, steadily climbing the corporate ladder. He had outworked many of his peers, pushing through challenges and obstacles, earning respect along the way. But he also knew that in the world of corporate finance, hard work was just one part of the equation. Talent wasn't always enough. Perception mattered just as much. And as a black man in a predominantly white industry, he had learned that the hard way. It wasn't just about being good at what you did, it was about how others saw you. Today, Jordan had an interview for the coveted position of head of investment strategies. The role was a game changer, a chance to reach the upper echelons of the company, along with the prestige and salary that came with it. It was the promotion he had worked tirelessly for, and it would provide him with the financial stability to support his mother and put his younger sister through college. This was his moment, the culmination of years of sacrifice. But Jordan wasn't the only one eyeing the position. Across town, Brad Reynolds, a 34-year-old white man, cruised through the streets of Atlanta in his shiny silver Mercedes. He wore a self-satisfied grin, knowing his place in the world. Unlike Jordan, Brad hadn't had to fight for anything. Born into a wealthy family with connections that opened doors, Brad had never experienced the struggles that Jordan had faced. To him, success wasn't something you earned. It was something you were born into. And today, he was convinced that the promotion was his for the taking. Brad's life had been easy in comparison. His connections, the right schools, and a polished appearance were all he needed to succeed. For him, this promotion wasn't about skill or hard work. It was about looking the part and playing the game. He had always been told that he was destined for leadership, and this job at Ellington & Company was merely another stepping stone on his path to greatness. Brad was certain that he was the right fit for the position, and Jordan wasn't even a real contender. As Jordan checked his watch and glanced at the clock on his car's dashboard, he felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. He had exactly 25 minutes to make it to the interview, and traffic was heavy, but it wasn't impossible. He could do it if he stayed focused. That's when he saw something that made him hesitate. A beat-up sedan stranded on the side of the road with its hazard lights flashing. A woman, probably in her 60s, stood next to the car looking helpless. Jordan's first instinct was to ignore it. He didn't have time to stop. He couldn't afford to be late. His future was on the line. But as he glanced at the woman again, something in him knew he couldn't just drive past. His mother had always taught him to do the right thing, even when it wasn't convenient. He had always believed that character mattered, that integrity was more important than anything else. With a deep breath, Jordan turned on his signal and pulled over to the shoulder of the road. "Morning, ma'am. Need some help?" he asked as he stepped out of the car, his voice calm but warm. The woman looked up at him, her sharp eyes studying him carefully. After a moment, she nodded, her voice steady despite her frustration. "I tried to fix it myself, but these old hands aren't what they used to be." Jordan smiled. "No trouble at all." He rolled up his sleeves and crouched down beside the car, already assessing the flat tire. Time was running out, but he couldn't leave her stranded. Helping this woman was the right thing to do, and no amount of pressure from the upcoming interview would change that. Jordan crouched beside the elderly woman's car, his fingers working quickly as he unscrewed the lug nuts from the flat tire. The morning sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the highway, but to Jordan it felt like time was slipping away. Every second spent here meant a second closer to missing his interview, and the promotion he had spent years fighting for. But as he worked, something inside him kept him focused. He wasn't just changing a tire, he was making a choice. It wasn't easy. He had prepared for this interview for months, studying every angle, rehearsing answers, perfecting his pitch. Today was supposed to be his big day, but as he looked up at the woman standing beside him, her face worn with age and hardship, he couldn't help but feel that this moment was just as important as anything that lay ahead. Helping her was the right thing to do. The woman, who had introduced herself as Miss Evelyn Brooks, stood with her arms crossed, observing Jordan's every move. Her eyes were sharp, taking in the way he worked, the way he held himself. Jordan could feel the weight of her gaze, but he didn't flinch. He kept his focus on the task at hand, tightening the jack and setting the spare tire into place. "You sure about this, son?" she asked after a pause, her voice low but laced with concern. "I don't want to be the reason you lose something important." Jordan didn't look up immediately. He knew what she meant. She had seen the gleaming suit and the polished shoes, the perfect outfit that screamed professional. She knew this interview was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for him, yet in that moment, it didn't matter. The woman needed help, and he was in a position to give it. That was enough. "Don't worry about me," Jordan said with a small smile. "Doing the right thing still matters, even when it's hard." Ms. Brooks studied him for a moment, her arms still crossed, her expression unreadable. There was a long silence between them, but Jordan didn't break it. He kept working, methodically tightening each lug nut and ensuring the tire was secure. Then, just as he was about to finish, he heard the familiar sound of a car approaching. A sleek, silver vehicle slowed to a stop beside them, and Jordan didn't need to look up to know who it was. The smug, arrogant voice that called out to him was all too familiar. "Well, well, well, look at this," Brad Reynolds' voice sliced through the morning air. "I didn't realize you had a side gig. Thought you were heading to the interview, but looks like you decided to play mechanic instead." Jordan's jaw tightened, but he didn't react. He kept his focus on the task at hand, trying to ignore Brad's voice as it dripped with mockery. Brad's car door swung open with a dramatic creak, and he stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks with an air of superiority. "What happened, Adams? Decided finance wasn't your thing?" he continued, walking closer with a smug grin. "Thought maybe fixing tires was more your style." Jordan's grip on the wrench tightened, but he didn't respond. He refused to give Brad the satisfaction of a reaction. This wasn't new. Brad had always been the type to mock Jordan, to undermine him at every opportunity. And yet Jordan had learned long ago that fighting back wasn't worth it. Brad's words were nothing more than noise, and Jordan wouldn't let them affect him. Brad leaned in closer, his voice growing louder. "You really think you're going to walk into Winter's company looking like that?" He scoffed, his eyes sweeping over Jordan's now grease-streaked sleeves and the dust on his slacks. "You look like you just crawled out from under a bridge. Do you really think they'll take someone like you seriously? A guy like you doesn't get to run a department?" Jordan paused for a brief moment, his fingers still wrapped around the wrench, but he didn't lift his gaze. He stayed calm, refusing to let Brad's words get under his skin. It was exactly what Brad wanted, an outburst, a reaction. But Jordan wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Ms. Brooks, who had been standing quietly by, her arms crossed, turned her gaze toward Brad. There was a subtle shift in her stance as she watched him, but she didn't say anything at first. Instead, she simply observed, her eyes hardening as Brad continued his tirade. Brad's taunts grew more biting, his voice laced with venom as he continued to belittle Jordan. "This is why people like you don't get to sit at the table. You can wear the nicest suits, but when it comes down to it, you'll never be more than just another statistic." He chuckled, clearly proud of himself. Jordan took a slow, steady breath. The anger was bubbling up inside him, but he kept it in check. This wasn't the time to get emotional. Instead, he did something that Brad wouldn't expect. He didn't react. He didn't give in to the provocation. He simply tightened the final lug nut, straightened up, and gave Ms. Brooks a small nod. "There you go, ma'am. All set," he said calmly. Ms. Brooks didn't speak at first. She just watched him for a moment longer, her gaze thoughtful. Then with a subtle smile, she said, "I think you're right about something, son." Jordan raised an eyebrow, but before he could respond, Brad scoffed, muttering under his breath. Jordan didn't react, but inside he felt a quiet sense of pride. He had done the right thing, and that in the end was what mattered. As Brad's car sped off, leaving behind a trail of arrogance, Jordan let out a deep, steadying breath. The tension in his shoulders slowly began to ease, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that the weight of the morning had shifted something inside him. He had made the right decision to stop, even if it meant possibly losing his chance at the interview. Ms. Brooks stood silently beside him, still watching. Her arms were now relaxed, though her gaze was sharp, assessing. Jordan wiped the back of his hand across his forehead, trying to wipe away the bead of sweat that had formed. His clothes were now stained with grease, the once pristine navy blue suit now a mess of dirt and oil smudges. "You all right, son?" she asked, her voice calm but with a tinge of concern. Jordan nodded, trying to brush off the discomfort. "I'm good. I wasn't expecting the day to go like this, that's all." Ms. Brooks smiled softly, though it wasn't a typical smile of comfort. There was something knowing in it, something that seemed to say she already understood more than he could possibly know. For a brief moment, Jordan thought he saw something else flicker in her eyes, something that hinted at recognition or perhaps even a hidden amusement. But before he could dwell on it, she spoke again. "Well, son, you've done a good thing today," she said, her voice full of quiet approval. "That's more than I can say for some." Jordan chuckled, not quite sure how to respond. He wasn't used to receiving praise for doing the right thing, especially from someone who seemed to be in such a powerful position. He finished tightening the last of the lug nuts and stood up, brushing his hands off. "Well, Ms. Brooks, I hope I didn't keep you too long. I know I'm running out of time," Jordan said, glancing at his watch. "Only 15 minutes left." His heart skipped at the thought of being late for the interview. The pressure was back, heavy on his chest. "You don't need to worry about that," Ms. Brooks said softly. And for the first time, Jordan noticed the change in her voice. It wasn't just casual. There was something more deliberate in her tone, like she was speaking to him as though she already knew what would happen next. "It's a shame, though. You've got a good head on your shoulders, son. Maybe you're meant for bigger things than you know." Jordan stopped, looking at her with curiosity. "Bigger things than I know?" Ms. Brooks smiled again, a knowing, almost amused smile. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze meeting his for a long moment. "You'll understand soon enough." Before Jordan could respond, Ms. Brooks opened the car door to the sedan and placed her hand on the handle. "I appreciate your help today, Jordan. I'm sure you'll find that things work out just as they should." The words hung in the air as she started to get in the car. Jordan stood still for a moment, his mind racing. There was something about her, something different. She wasn't just another elderly woman who needed help with a flat tire. The way she spoke, the quiet confidence, the way she had observed him, it all seemed deliberate. But what did it mean? His mind snapped back to the present as he realized just how much time had passed. He had to leave, or he would be late for the interview, and that could mean losing everything he had worked for. "Thank you again, Ms. Brooks. I really do appreciate your understanding," Jordan said as he quickly grabbed his jacket from the trunk of his car and tossed it over his arm. "I hope you get home safely." Ms. Brooks nodded without saying another word. She gave him a final glance, her eyes lingering for just a second longer than normal. "Drive safe, son." Jordan slid into his car, his mind still spinning from the encounter. As he drove away, the image of Ms. Brooks' knowing smile lingered. He pushed the thoughts aside, telling himself he couldn't afford to dwell on it. He needed to focus. Time was running out, and the interview was everything. Jordan's pulse quickened as he stepped out of the elevator and onto the sleek executive floor. The high-rise was everything he had imagined it to be, sharp, modern, and full of cold, clinical precision. Every detail was polished, and the air seemed to hum with ambition and power. This was the place where people like him could rise, if they were good enough, if they played the game right. And he had been playing that game for years. He adjusted his tie and ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the remnants of his earlier encounter. His clothes were still a mess, with dirt and grease staining his once pristine suit, but there was no turning back now. He had come too far to let the morning's events stop him. Today, everything depended on this interview. Jordan took a deep breath and walked toward the conference room, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would say. He had rehearsed his answers 1,000 times in his head, prepared for every question, every possible angle. This was his chance to prove that he belonged at the top of the corporate ladder. When he reached the door, he hesitated. He had arrived exactly on time despite the detour, but the weight of the moment still hung heavily over him. He could hear voices inside, the members of the board waiting for him, the CEO, the decision maker. With a final breath, he pushed open the door. The room fell silent. The large conference table was filled with executives, but it was the person sitting at the head of the table who immediately caught Jordan's attention. Sitting there, calm and composed, was none other than Evelyn Brooks, the woman he had helped fix her tire on the side of the road that morning. The realization hit him like a freight train. She wasn't just an elderly stranger. She was the CEO of Winter's company, the one person who had the power to make or break his future. She had seen everything, every word, every insult from Brad Reynolds, every moment of his character and integrity on display. Jordan froze, his heart racing. He hadn't known that the woman he had helped was in charge of the very company he had been fighting to join, and now she was watching him closely, her eyes assessing him as if weighing his every move. The room was heavy with tension. For a moment, no one spoke. The other executives seemed to be just as stunned by the revelation as Jordan was. But then Brad's voice broke the silence. "You've got to be kidding me," Brad scoffed, his voice tight with disbelief. His face was pale as he looked around the room, realizing what had just happened. The cocky confidence he had walked in with was now gone, replaced by panic. I didn't realize," Brad stammered, struggling to find his words. He shifted in his seat, trying to regain his composure. But it was clear to everyone in the room that something had shifted. Jordan had seen it in Brad's eyes. He knew what was coming. Ms. Brooks didn't flinch. Her gaze never wavered as she slowly folded her hands in front of her on the table. "Mr. Reynolds, is there a problem?" Brad's mouth opened and closed, but he couldn't find a response. His arrogance, once a hallmark of his personality, was now gone. He looked around the room as if searching for an escape from the situation that was unraveling in front of him. But there was no way out. I didn't know," Brad muttered under his breath. "I just thought," but Ms. Brooks cut him off. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice calm and steady, "this isn't about what you thought. It's about what you did and what you've shown me today." Brad's face flushed with anger, his voice rising. "I don't understand. I was on time. I came prepared. I've been with the company longer than he has. Why him?" Ms. Brooks leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp. "Leadership isn't just about experience, Mr. Reynolds. It's about character. It's about making the right choice, even when no one is watching." Brad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He tried to speak, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. His earlier insults, his mockery of Jordan, now seemed hollow. His arrogance had been exposed. "You see," Ms. Brooks continued, "when Jordan chose to stop and help someone in need, he showed me more about his leadership abilities than any resume or presentation ever could. You, on the other hand, chose to belittle him, to mock him for doing what was right." Brad's face twisted in frustration, but his shoulders sagged. His mask of confidence was gone, replaced with something much darker. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Ms. Brooks stood up, her presence commanding the room. "I've made my decision, Mr. Reynolds. You're no longer being considered for the role of head of investment strategies." Brad's jaw clenched as he stood abruptly, his eyes narrowing in anger. "This is bullshit," he spat, but he didn't wait for a response. He stormed out of the room, leaving behind the remains of his shattered confidence. The silence in the room was palpable. Ms. Brooks turned her gaze to Jordan, her expression unreadable. She didn't smile, but there was something in her eyes, a knowing, almost approving look. "Well, Mr. Adams," she said, "shall we discuss your new role?" Jordan's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward, no longer questioning the course of events. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice steady. "Let's talk." 3 months had passed since that pivotal day in the conference room, and life at Winter's company had moved forward as it always did. The office continued to buzz with the same frenetic energy, the high-stakes deals, and the unyielding pressure to succeed. Jordan had settled into his new role as the head of investment strategies, working long hours and navigating the complex world of leadership with the same patience and integrity that had gotten him here in the first place. He had earned the respect of his colleagues, not just for his intelligence and work ethic, but for the way he led, quietly with humility and strength. Jordan was everything that the company needed: capable, diligent, and most importantly, someone who valued character above all else. As he moved through the halls of the office, he knew that this was just the beginning. He had proved his worth, and now he was building a legacy of his own. But things had changed for Brad Reynolds too. Jordan didn't expect to see much of Brad after his embarrassing exit from the interview room, but the few times their paths had crossed, he noticed a difference. Gone was the smug arrogance that had once defined Brad's every step. Instead, there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a quiet humility that Jordan couldn't help but notice. One afternoon, as Jordan passed by an intern's desk, he saw Brad kneeling down, helping a young woman pick up a stack of fallen documents. For a moment, Jordan stopped in his tracks. Brad, the man who had once mocked him, the man who had tried to undermine him at every turn, was now doing something as simple as helping someone else in need. His posture wasn't rigid anymore. His face wasn't hard with superiority. It was as if the world had suddenly softened for him. Jordan watched for a moment longer before continuing down the hall. He couldn't help but smile, a small, quiet smile of recognition. Some lessons, no matter how painful, had a way of planting seeds. And though Brad's transformation wasn't immediate, it was real. That evening, as Jordan sat in his office going over the latest projections for the company, he thought about how far he had come and how far Brad had come as well. It hadn't been easy for either of them, but in the end, it was clear that character, integrity, and the willingness to do the right thing, even when no one was watching, had led them both to new places. Jordan reflected on the morning he had helped Ms. Brooks, the moment when he chose to do the right thing, despite the consequences. If he had let Brad's words or the pressure of the interview stand in his way, he might never have earned the respect of the right people. He had shown Ms. Brooks and the company who he was not just by his resume, but by his actions. As the years passed, Jordan continued to rise, earning the respect of everyone around him. He stayed true to his values, knowing that success, when earned the right way, was far more rewarding than any promotion or title. And every now and then, he would catch a glimpse of Brad, no longer the arrogant man he once was, but someone who had learned the value of humility, patience, and a helping hand. Sometimes it took the harshest lessons to bring about real change, and for both of them, that was exactly what had happened. One afternoon, as Jordan walked past the intern's desk, he caught Brad's gaze. For the first time, there was no sneer, no arrogance. There was just a quiet nod, an acknowledgement, a moment of understanding between them. Jordan returned the nod, and as he walked away, he allowed himself a small, quiet smile. Some people changed, some didn't. But in this moment, Jordan knew that he had done the right thing, and that was enough.